In the waning years of the 13th century, the British Isles stood on the brink of transformation. At the centre of this change was Edward I of England, a monarch whose reign was defined by his relentless pursuit of order, conquest, and centralized power. Known by his epithet Longshanks due to his towering stature, and later remembered as the Hammer of the Scots, Edward was a formidable ruler who sought not only to maintain England's dominance, but to expand it, especially into neighbouring territories like Wales and Scotland. Having completed a brutal but effective conquest of Wales by 1283, Edward turned his eyes northward. The Kingdom of Scotland, though independent, had fallen into a period of uncertainty. The death of King Alexander III in 1286, followed by the death of his granddaughter and heir Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290, left the Scottish throne vacant and the realm vulnerable. A succession crisis ensued, with multiple claimants vying for power. The Scottish nobility invited Edward I to arbitrate the matter, and in 1292 he declared John Balliol the rightful king. He demanded Balliol acknowledge him as overlord of Scotland, turning what was supposed to be an independent ally into a subordinate state. Tensions quickly escalated. Balliol's efforts to assert Scottish independence angered Edward, who saw it as defiance. In 1296, Edward invaded Scotland with a powerful army. He crushed the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar, sacked towns, and seized the Stone of Scorn, a powerful symbol of Scottish kingship, which he brought back to Westminster. John Balliol was stripped of his crown, humiliated, and imprisoned. Edward declared Scotland was now under English rule. But conquest did not bring peace. Resistance began to build almost immediately, and soon Edward faced a new kind of enemy: William Wallace, a lesser noble who rose to prominence after launching a successful rebellion in 1297. Wallace's stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge was a major blow to English prestige. Though Edward later crushed Wallace's forces at Falkirk in 1298 and eventually captured and executed him in 1305, Wallace's defiance had lit a fire that would not be extinguished. It was during this period of simmering unrest that another figure stepped onto the stage: Robert the Bruce. A descendant of earlier Scottish royalty, Bruce had a claim to the throne. Bruce's rebellion was a direct challenge to Edward I's authority. The English king, enraged, launched a fresh invasion of Scotland, vowing to crush Bruce as he had Wallace. Though Bruce suffered several early defeats and was forced into hiding, he gradually rebuilt his forces and support among the Scottish clans. Meanwhile, Edward I's health began to decline. In 1307, as he marched north for yet another campaign, the king fell ill. On July 7th, Edward I died at Burr by Sands near the Scottish border, never having completed his mission to subdue Scotland once and for all. His death left the throne to his only surviving son, Edward II, a king whose reign would be shaped by the unfinished wars of his predecessor, the unrelenting rebellion of Robert the Bruce, and the deep fractures within his own kingdom. Edward II was born on April 25, 1284, at Caernarfon Castle in North Wales. His birth came at a time of immense political and military significance. Just 1 year earlier, his father Edward I had completed his conquest of Wales, crushing the last major resistance and establishing English control over the region. Caernarfon Castle itself, still under construction when Edward was born, was a grand symbol of this victory, a fortress and royal palace designed to project English power deep into Welsh territory. Edward II was the 14th of at least 16 children, born to Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, a Spanish princess who had married Edward in 1254. Of all their children, only a few survived into adulthood, and Edward II was the youngest surviving son. By the time of his birth, he had already become an important dynastic figure, especially after the deaths of his elder brothers. He would be the first English prince to hold the title Prince of Wales, a title Edward I granted him in 1301 as part of his efforts to integrate Wales into the English crown. As the heir apparent to one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, Edward's early life was shaped by high expectations, but also by isolation from the workings of real power. His father was frequently away on military campaigns and ruled with a stern, commanding presence that left little room for personal affection or tolerance for weakness. Edward I valued strength, discipline, and leadership, and by many accounts he found his son lacking in these qualities. While Edward II received the standard education of a royal prince, including instruction in Latin, theology, and courtly manners. Even as a child, Edward II's personality set him apart. He showed little interest in warfare or politics, and instead gravitated toward music, the arts, and outdoor leisure. He had a fondness for rowing, swimming, and farming, unusual preferences for a future king in a militarized court. Edward's relationship with his father was further strained by his growing attachment to certain companions, especially Piers Gaveston, a young knight from Gascony. Gaveston entered Edward's household in the early 1300s and quickly became a favorite. Their closeness would eventually trigger political turmoil, and Edward I viewed Gaveston's influence as dangerous and inappropriate. In 1307, the aging king took the significant step of banishing Gaveston from England. That same year, everything changed. Edward I died during his final campaign against Robert the Bruce. Edward II, just 23 years old, was now king. Edward II was crowned King of England on February 25, 1308, in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The coronation marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Plantagenet dynasty. One of the most controversial aspects of Edward's early reign was his insistence on the return and elevation of Piers Gaveston. Within weeks of his accession, Edward recalled Gaveston from exile and bestowed upon him the prestigious title of Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. Gaveston was not only restored to favor, but placed at the very center of power. He was made the king's chief advisor, granted estates, and given a level of influence that infuriated the English barons. Many of them viewed Gaveston as arrogant and unworthy, and they deeply resented the king's reliance on him. The coronation itself became a focal point for this discontent. Though the ceremony followed traditional rites, it was marred by tension. The English nobles were offended that Gaveston played such a prominent role in the proceedings, even carrying the royal crown, an honor that many believed should have been reserved for a great magnate of the realm. The barons, already wary of the young king's temperament, began to see Gaveston not just as a court favorite, but as a threat to the balance of power. Amidst these rising tensions, Edward's marriage to Isabella of France was intended as a diplomatic triumph. Isabella, just 12 years old at the time of their union, was the daughter of Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. The marriage had been arranged as part of the Treaty of Montreuil in 1299 and reaffirmed in 1303, designed to secure peace between England and France over long-standing disputes. In theory, the marriage strengthened Edward's position. It tied him to one of Europe's most powerful royal houses and helped stabilize England's uneasy relationship with its continental rival. But the marriage quickly became complicated. Although Isabella would eventually play a major role in English politics, especially later in Edward's life, in these early years she was a young and politically passive consort. More critically, Edward showed little interest in establishing a strong marital bond. Instead, his focus remained on Gaveston, who dominated his time and court. This imbalance did not go unnoticed in France. Philip IV, a formidable and shrewd ruler, was angered by his son-in-law's favoritism and disrespect toward his daughter. As Edward II settled into his reign, it became clear that the king's unwavering devotion to Piers Gaveston would not be tolerated indefinitely. The English barons, especially the most powerful among them, grew increasingly hostile. At the forefront of this opposition was Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, one of the wealthiest and most influential noblemen in the realm, and a cousin to the king. In 1311, their frustrations culminated in a formal challenge to royal authority. The barons demanded reforms, and Edward was forced to submit. That year, a committee of 21 lords drafted and imposed a document known as the Ordinances of 1311. These ordinances were not mere suggestions. They were a legal restriction on the king's powers. They placed the control of finances, royal appointments, and foreign policy largely in the hands of the barons. Crucially, they demanded the permanent exile of Piers Gaveston. Edward, under pressure, initially agreed. Gaveston was once again banished, but the king had no intention of letting the matter rest. In defiance of the ordinances, Edward secretly recalled Gaveston in 1312 and welcomed him back with full honours. This brazen act shattered the fragile truce with the nobility and triggered a full-blown crisis. The barons led by Lancaster and the Earls of Warwick and Pembroke declared Gaveston a traitor. A brief but intense military campaign followed. Gaveston, lacking the protection of a strong military force, attempted to flee but was eventually captured near Scarborough. Though he had been promised safe custody by some of the more moderate nobles, he was handed over to the Earl of Warwick, who had no intention of honouring such promises. On June 19, 1312, without a formal trial, Gaveston was executed on Blacklow Hill, his body left abandoned as a stark warning. The death of Gaveston was a personal tragedy for Edward II. He mourned his friend bitterly, but it also deepened the gulf between the king and the nobility. Edward now sought revenge against those who had defied him, but lacked the political strength and military resources to act decisively. As tensions mounted at home, Edward's foreign policy also began to unravel. His marriage to Isabella of France, once a symbol of Anglo-French diplomacy, was showing signs of strain. Isabella, now older and more politically aware, was increasingly alienated by her husband's erratic governance and his continued reliance on unpopular favourites. Her father, Philip IV of France, was angered by the disrespect shown to his daughter and by Edward's poor management of English territories in France, particularly Gascony. By 1314, Edward II faced a test of his kingship that would have far-reaching consequences, not only for his authority, but for the very standing of England in Britain. Since the death of Edward I in 1307, Robert the Bruce had steadily consolidated his power in Scotland, reasserting independence and reclaiming territory lost during earlier English campaigns. While Edward II had launched several military expeditions north of the border, none matched the vigour or strategic clarity of his father's efforts. As Bruce's influence grew, the need for a decisive English response became impossible to ignore. In the summer of 1314, Edward assembled a massive army, estimated at around 20,000 men, to relieve Stirling Castle, one of the last major English strongholds in Scotland. The castle had been under siege by Robert the Bruce's forces, and its governor had agreed to surrender if not relieved by midsummer. The trap was set. On June 23, 1314, the English and Scottish armies clashed near the Bannockburn, just south of Stirling. Edward held a numerical advantage, but the terrain favoured Bruce, who had chosen the battlefield carefully. The Scots, well prepared and fighting on familiar ground, made excellent use of schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen to repel English cavalry. Bruce's leadership proved calm and confident, in stark contrast to Edward's erratic command. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the English. Hundreds of knights were killed or captured, and Edward himself fled the battlefield and barely escaped to safety. The Battle of Bannockburn was not just a military failure, it was a humiliation that shattered any illusion of English supremacy in Scotland. It elevated Robert the Bruce as a national hero and effectively secured Scotland's independence for the next generation. Back in England, the consequences of Bannockburn were deeply felt. Edward's authority, already fragile, was now in tatters. His inability to lead in war had been made plain, and his political opponents at home, especially Thomas of Lancaster, were quick to exploit the king's embarrassment. To make matters worse, England was about to be gripped by one of the worst natural disasters of the medieval era, the Great Famine. Beginning in 1315, relentless rains destroyed crops across much of northern Europe, including England. Harvests failed year after year, fields flooded, cattle died of disease. Food prices soared, and starvation became widespread among the peasantry. Law and order in the countryside broke down as desperate people resorted to theft and violence. The famine lasted until 1317, and its toll was devastating. Tens of thousands died, and the economic impact deepened the misery of Edward's already troubled reign. By the time England began to recover from the Great Famine in the late 1330s, Edward II was increasingly isolated, both politically and personally. The loss of Gaveston had left a void in the king's inner circle, but Edward soon found new favourites in the Despenser family. Particularly Hugh Despenser the Younger, a cunning and ambitious nobleman who, like Gaveston before him, would come to wield extraordinary influence over the crown. The Despensers rose to prominence in 1318, with Hugh the Younger quickly becoming Edward's closest advisor and companion. The Despensers accumulated land, titles and wealth at a rapid pace, most notably in the Welsh Marches, an area where their increasing power came at the direct expense of other powerful barons. This concentration of favour and privilege ignited fresh resentment among the nobility, particularly the Marcher lords, who had long controlled semi-independent territories along the border with Wales. Chief among the discontented were Roger Mortimer and Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford. They viewed the Despensers as a threat not only to their holdings, but to the balance of power in the kingdom. Meanwhile, Thomas of Lancaster, long an opponent of royal favourites, found common cause with the Marcher lords. By 1321, tensions exploded into open rebellion. The conflict became known as the Dispenser War. It began with a coordinated uprising in the Welsh Marches, where Mortimer and other barons launched attacks on Despenser estates, seizing lands and driving out Despenser supporters. They issued a formal declaration demanding the permanent exile of both Hugh Despensers. In the face of widespread baronial support and rising public anger, Edward reluctantly agreed and sent the Despensers into temporary exile. But this concession was short-lived. Edward was determined to restore his favourites, and by early 1322, he began to rebuild his authority with the help of loyal nobles and military support. He recalled the Despensers, rearmed his forces, and set out to crush the rebellion once and for all. In March of that year, the royal army confronted the rebel forces at the Battle of Boroughbridge. The battle was a decisive royal victory. Lancaster's forces, poorly organised and lacking sufficient support, were defeated. Lancaster himself was captured, tried for treason and executed, an act that shocked the nobility, as he was not only a royal cousin but one of the most powerful men in the country. The victory over the barons gave Edward a brief moment of supremacy, but it only masked the deeper crisis at the heart of his rule. While Edward II was busy consolidating power at home, trouble was once again brewing on the continent. Tensions with France, long simmering over feudal obligations and territorial disputes, erupted into conflict in 1324 in what became known as the War of Saint-Sardos. At the heart of the dispute was the region of Gascony, a valuable English-held territory in southwestern France. Although it had been under English control for centuries, it was held by the English king as a vassal of the French crown. The immediate spark came in the small village of Saint-Sardos, located just outside the Duchy of Aquitaine. In 1323, a Gascon noble supported by English interests challenged the authority of a French-appointed judge who sought to establish royal control over the area. The situation escalated when one of Edward's Gascon vassals burned the village in defiance of French claims. King Charles IV of France, Isabella's brother, treated the attack as a provocation and a challenge to French sovereignty. In 1324, he launched a swift military campaign into Gascony, seizing several key towns and fortresses. The French forces, better organized and enjoying local support, quickly overran most of the contested areas. Edward II, distracted by internal affairs and unwilling to confront France militarily, responded slowly and ineffectively. As the war unfolded, Queen Isabella of France found herself in an increasingly delicate position. She was both the wife of the English king and the sister of the French king. For years, she had tolerated Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston and later the Despensers, but by the mid-1320s, her patience had worn thin. The Despensers had not only alienated the English nobility, but also treated the Queen with open disrespect, seizing lands that were part of her dower and undermining her influence at court. Isabella's frustrations with her husband turned into open resentment. She began to withdraw from Edward's inner circle, refusing to share court functions. The war with France deepened the divide. As Queen of England and sister to the French monarch, she was placed in a position that should have made her a natural peacemaker. But Edward, under the influence of Hugh Despenser the Younger, blocked her efforts and refused to send her to negotiate in France. Eventually, under growing pressure to resolve the Gascon crisis, Edward agreed to send a representative to Paris. But rather than sending one of his barons, he allowed Isabella to act on his behalf. In 1325, she travelled to France with her son, Prince Edward, to negotiate peace and perform homage to Charles IV for Gascony. Once in France, Isabella refused to return to England. No longer content with defiance, she had entered into a strategic and deeply controversial alliance with Roger Mortimer, the exiled Marcher lord and former enemy of the crown. Their relationship, both political and by most accounts personal, formed the backbone of a new rebellion aimed at nothing less than the overthrow of the king. Together, Isabella and Mortimer began building support among disaffected English nobles, exiles, and even some foreign backers. They gathered forces in the Low Countries, with the covert support of William I, Count of Hainault, whose daughter Philippa was promised in marriage to Isabella's son Prince Edward in exchange for military aid. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed on the coast of Essex, accompanied by a relatively small but highly motivated army. The invasion began almost without resistance. Across the country, support for Edward had eroded to the point of collapse. Nobles, clergy, and commoners alike rallied to Isabella's cause, and local officials defected to the rebels as they advanced through the southeast. As rebel forces marched unopposed toward London, the king panicked. In October, Edward and the Dispensers fled the capital, heading west toward Wales in search of loyalist strongholds. London welcomed Isabella and Mortimer, and Prince Edward, now seen as the rightful successor, was presented to the people as a symbol of legitimate rule. The final collapse came swiftly. Pursued across southern Wales, Edward was eventually captured near Llantrysant in November 1326. Hugh Despenser the Younger was seized alongside him. Despenser's fate was sealed. He was taken to Hereford, where he faced a rapid and brutal trial. Condemned for treason and various other crimes, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. On January 20th, 1327, Edward II was officially deposed, the first English king to be removed by parliamentary action. The crown was offered to his son, now King Edward III, just 14 years old. Because of his youth, Isabella and Mortimer acted as regents, ruling in his name. Edward II was imprisoned first at Kenilworth Castle and later transferred to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. There, his fate remained uncertain. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery and controversy. In September 1327, rumors spread that Edward had died while in captivity. Edward III, once a boy king crowned in the shadow of his father's downfall, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history.